I attended my husband's funeral 3 years ago, but tonight he was the one staring at me from across the room. The chandeliers above the Manhattan restaurant glowed like quiet stars reflecting off polished marble and crystal glasses while I kept my eyes down, balancing a silver tray in hands that had learned not to tremble. My name wasn't Emily Carter anymore, at least not out loud, not in a world that had already buried me. I counted steps instead of memories, measured distance instead of time. 12 feet to the table, 8 feet back to the bar. Never look up, never be remembered. That was the rule until the door opened and the air changed. It wasn't loud, no one announced him, but every conversation softened, every movement slowed, like the room itself recognized power before the mind could catch up. Alexander Kane walked in, wearing a black suit that fit like certainty, his presence pulling silence behind him. Like a shadow, I felt it before I saw him. The way you feel a storm before the first drop falls, and I told myself not to look, but instinct betrayed me. My eyes lifted just enough, and the world collapsed. His gaze locked onto mine, and everything stopped. The tray felt heavier, the lights dimmer, the sound of my own heartbeat louder than the entire room. He didn't blink, he didn't move. He just stared like he'd seen something impossible, like he'd seen a ghost. Emily, he said my name soft, but sharp enough to cut through 3 years of lies. I forced a breath, forced my lips into something that almost resembled a smile. You've got the wrong person. I said the words steady, even as my pulse betrayed me, but he stepped closer, slow, deliberate, each step closing a distance I had spent years creating. I could see it now, the recognition, the disbelief, the anger buried under control, and something else, something dangerous, something that remembered me even when it shouldn't have. His eyes dropped to my hands, and I followed his gaze. Too late, the thin fabric of my glove shifted just enough to reveal the faint outline beneath a ring I never stopped wearing. He leaned in close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, but not touch close enough to remind me of a life I had erased. I watched you burn, he whispered, and for a second the room disappeared, leaving only that sentence hanging between us, heavy, undeniable. I swallowed, the truth rising in my throat, because if he ever found out why I had to disappear, why his world had nearly ended me once before, then the man standing in front of me wouldn't just remember me. He would tear everything apart to find the answer, and this time there would be no running from what comes after. The tray slipped from my fingers, not enough to fall, but enough for the glasses to tremble and betray me. I steadied it quickly, years of practice, hiding every crack in my composure, but he saw it, of course. He saw everything. Alexander Kane did not miss details. That was how he built his empire, how he survived, how he destroyed anything that threatened him, and right now I was standing directly in his line of sight, pretending I was not the woman he had once promised forever to. Look at me, he said quietly, not a command, not yet, but it carried the weight of one. Anyway, I shook my head just slightly, keeping my voice low. You are making a mistake, sir. I can get your table ready. Sir, the word tasted wrong between us. It always had, even before everything fell apart, but it was safer now, safer than saying his name, safer than acknowledging the past. Breathing between us, his jaw tightened, not anger, not fully, but something close to it, restrained, controlled. Like everything about him always was. You never called me that, he replied, and the familiarity in his tone almost broke me. I forced myself to move, stepping back, creating distance, because distance meant control, and control meant survival. People change, I said, and turned before he could answer, before I could see the moment. Recognition fully replaced doubt behind me. I felt it, the shift in the room, the quiet awareness that something unusual was happening, even if no one understood what it was. I walked straight to the service corridor, heart pounding too fast, too loud, every step echoing like a countdown, and I told myself not to run, never run. That draws attention, but the second I pushed through the swinging door into the dim hallway, I exhaled, like I had been holding my breath for 3 years. Emily, my name again, closer, this time closer than it should have been. I froze for half a second before forcing my body forward, but it was too late. His footsteps followed, steady, unhurried, inevitable. I turned the corner and almost collided with him. He was already there, blocking the narrow hallway, like he had always known exactly where I would go, how I would move, how I would try to escape. He did not touch me. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to hold me in place. You are alive, he said, and it was not a question. There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not in all the years we had known each other, not even on the day everything ended, something raw, something unguarded, and it made my chest tighten in a way I could not afford. I lifted my chin, forcing strength into a moment that wanted to collapse. I told you you are mistaken, I repeated. But the words sounded weaker now, thinner against the truth. Standing inches away from me, his eyes searched my face, not quickly, not impatiently, but with a precision that felt like he was memorizing every detail, confirming every memory against the woman in front of him. I buried you, he said again, softer this time, like he was reminding himself more than accusing me, and I felt it, the past, pressing in the sound of rain, the smell of smoke, the weight of goodbye that was never meant to be permanent. And yet here I am, I replied, before I could stop myself, and that was the mistake, because something shifted in his expression, certainty. Replacing doubt completely, he stepped closer, just one step, but it erased the last of the space between us. Why? He asked, not angry, not yet, just searching, and that was more dangerous than anything else, because anger I could handle, anger I could predict, but this need for answers, this refusal to let go, that was what I had been running from. My fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, grounding myself in something real, something present. Because staying would have killed me, I said quietly, and the truth slipped out before I could cage it again. Silence stretched between us, heavy, complicated, filled with everything we were not saying. His gaze sharpened, not with disbelief, but with something darker, something calculating, and I knew in that moment he believed me, or at least enough to start asking the questions that should never be asked. Who? He said just one word, but it carried the weight of consequences that would not stop. Once they started, my heart stumbled, because this was at the line I could not cross, the truth that would set everything on fire again. It does not matter anymore, I said, shaking my head, taking a step back. Even though I knew it would not be enough, it matters to me, he replied immediately, and there it was, the man I remembered, the one who never let anything go unfinished, the one who would tear apart the world piece by piece if it meant finding the answer he wanted. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second I saw the past, the man I loved, the life we almost had, and it hurt more than anything else. That is exactly why I left, I whispered, and before he could respond, before I could lose whatever strength I had left, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with a truth he was never supposed to find, and a past that was no longer willing to stay buried. The moment I stepped back onto the restaurant floor, I knew everything had already changed. The lights felt brighter, the air thinner, every sound too sharp, like the world had turned its attention toward me without anyone realizing why. I kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering was the one thing I could not afford. My hands worked on instinct, refilling glasses, clearing plates, nodding at conversations I did not hear, but my mind stayed in that hallway, replaying every word, every look, every second. His eyes held mine, like he had been searching for me all along. Emily, I flinched at the sound. Again, even though this time it came from my own memory, not his voice. I had spent 3 years training myself not to react to that name, not to turn, not to feel anything when it surfaced, and yet one night, one moment, and everything I built started to crack. I set down a glass too hard. The faint clink, drawing a glance from a nearby table. I forced a smile, apologizing softly before stepping away again. I needed space, I needed air, I needed him gone, but deep down I knew Alexander Kane did not walk away from anything unresolved, especially not me. I reached the back station, gripping the edge of the counter, grounding myself in something solid, something real. My reflection stared back at me in the polished surface, eyes wide, breathing uneven, not the calm, invisible woman I had trained myself to be. You should leave, the voice came from behind me, low, steady, not his, but familiar enough to make my shoulders tense. I turned slowly to find Marco, the floor manager, watching me with a look that held more understanding than I expected. You look like you just saw a ghost, he added, and I almost laughed at the irony, because in a way I had, or maybe I was the ghost here, haunting a life that was never supposed to exist anymore. I am fine, I said automatically, the lie practiced smooth. But he did not look convinced. The man out there, he continued, glancing toward the main floor. People do not look at him unless they have to, and he has not looked away from you since. He walked in. My chest tightened, because I already knew that I did not need confirmation, but hearing it made it real in a way I could not ignore. Just finish your shift, Marco said more gently now, and go home, whatever. That is, do not bring it back here tomorrow. Home, the word felt distant, unfamiliar. Like something that belonged to someone else. I nodded anyway. Because it was easier than explaining a life that no longer existed. I turned back to the counter, picking up a tray, forcing my hands to steady. Because I had one job left, one more hour, one more stretch of pretending before I could disappear again. I stepped out onto the floor and felt it immediately, his presence like gravity, pulling everything toward him. I did not look, I could not. But I knew exactly where he was seated, exactly how he would be, watching every move, every breath, every attempt. I made to stay out of reach. I moved between tables, careful, precise, controlled, until I reached his table without meaning to, or maybe I had always been moving toward it from the moment he walked in. There was no avoiding this, not anymore. I placed the glass in front of him slowly, keeping my eyes on the table, on anything but him. Your drink, I said, and the words sounded distant, like they belonged to someone else. Silence stretched for a second, then two, then I felt it, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, close enough to mine that I could see the familiar scar across his knuckle, the one I used to trace without thinking, the one detail I had never forgotten. You are leaving after this, he said, not asking, stating it like a fact, like a decision already made. My fingers tightened slightly around the tray. I have a schedule, I replied, but it sounded weak even to me, because schedules did not matter to a man like him. Nothing did except the answers he wanted. So do I, he said calmly, and I finally made the mistake of looking up. His eyes held mine steady, unyielding, but beneath the control I saw it, the shift, the storm building, not loud, not explosive, but inevitable. And tonight, he continued, his voice dropping just enough that only I could hear, you are part of it. My breath caught, because I knew exactly what that meant. Not control, not ownership, not the man he used to be, but something more dangerous, something personal. He was not letting me disappear again. I stepped back, instinct taking over, distance, always distance, but his gaze followed me, like it always had, like it always would. And in that moment, I understood something I had been trying not to see for the past 3 years. I did not just run from his world, I ran from him. And now that he had found me, there was no version of this story where he simply let me walk away again. I finished the shift without remembering a single order I served or a single face. I passed everything, blurred into motion, muscle memory, carrying me through while my mind stayed fixed on the man who refused to look away. When the last table cleared and the lights dimmed, slightly signaling closing time, I moved quickly to the back, grabbing my coat from the narrow locker, like it could shield me from what waited outside. I did not say goodbye. I did not check the schedule. I did not hesitate, because hesitation meant he would catch up before I was ready. The cold Manhattan air hit my face the second I stepped out onto the street, sharp and grounding, the city alive with distant traffic and muted conversations, as if nothing had shifted, as if my world had not just tilted off its axis. I started walking fast, not running, never running, but fast enough that my heartbeat matched my steps, heels striking pavement in a steady rhythm that felt like escape, until I saw it, a black car parked at the curb, engine running, lights dim, not blocking the street, not drawing attention, just there waiting, like it had always been part of the night. I slowed without meaning to, instinct tightening every nerve, because I knew before the door opened, before the figure stepped out, exactly who it would be. You should not walk alone this late, his voice carried across the short distance, calm, controlled, like this was a normal conversation between strangers, and not the continuation of something that had never truly ended. I stopped a few feet away, keeping the space between us, because space still meant something, even if it was only an illusion. I have been doing it for 3 years, I replied, my voice steady enough to hide the truth that I had been looking over my shoulder every single night. He stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, just closing the distance, with that same inevitability that had followed him all evening. 3 years without me knowing, he said quietly. And there it was again, not anger, not accusation, just something heavier, something that carried the weight of everything we had lost. That was the point, I answered, and wrapped my coat tighter around me, as if it could hold the past back. He studied me in silence, his eyes moving across my face like he was searching for pieces of the woman he used to know, matching memory against reality and finding something that did not quite align. You changed your name, he said. Finally, you changed everything. I shook my head slowly. Not everything, and before I could stop myself, my fingers brushed the edge of my glove. The ring beneath it, a truth I had never fully let go of. His gaze followed the movement, catching the detail instantly, and something in his expression shifted again, softer this time, but no less intense. "Then why disappear?" he asked. And the question felt different now, less like a demand, more like something he had been holding on to for 3 years, waiting for an answer that never came. I looked away toward the street, toward the endless motion of a city that did not care about past lives or buried names, because staying meant choosing a side, I said quietly. And every side wanted something from me that I could not give. He did not respond immediately, and when I looked back at him, I saw it, the understanding beginning to form, not complete, not clear, but enough to change the direction of his thoughts. "My world," he said, more to himself than to me, and I felt the truth settle between us, heavier than anything else. "Your world," I repeated softly, "the one that taught me how to survive, and then almost took that away from me." Silence followed, not empty, but filled with everything we were not saying, every memory, every moment, every promise that no longer existed the way it once had. A car passed, headlights sweeping over us, briefly illuminating his face, and for a second I saw the man I married, not the one the world feared, not the one who commanded silence with a glance, but the one who used to look at me like I was the only thing that mattered. "Get in the car," he said suddenly, and the shift in his tone pulled me back to the present, firm, controlled, decisive, the man who made decisions and expected them to be followed. I did not move. "That is not a request," he added, and I almost smiled because that part of him had not changed at all. "Then it is a problem," I replied, meeting his gaze evenly, because I had changed, and I was no longer the woman who followed without question. His eyes held mine for a long moment, calculating, adjusting, like he was rewriting a plan in real time. "If you walk away now," he said slowly, "I will still find the answer." My breath caught slightly, because I knew he meant it. There was no version of this where he stopped looking. "And if I get in that car?" I asked, already knowing the weight of the choice. "Then you tell me everything," he answered. And the city seemed to go quieter around us, as if waiting for my decision, because this was the moment. The line between past and present blurred completely, and whichever step I took next would decide if I stayed hidden or if I walked straight back into the life I had risked everything to escape. I looked at the car, then back at him, and for a moment everything narrowed down to a single choice: stay in the life I built out of silence, or step back into the one that almost erased me completely. My fingers tightened around the edge of my coat, grounding myself in something real, something present. But nothing about this moment felt real, not the city, not the cold, not the man standing in front of me, like a past I could not outrun. "You always did this," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "Turn everything into a decision that is not really a choice." A faint shift crossed his expression, not quite a smile, not quite regret, but something that remembered, because hesitation gets people hurt, he replied. And there it was, the truth of him, the part of his world that never changed, no matter how much I wished it had. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cold air, and for a second I let myself feel it, the weight of everything I had avoided for 3 years, pressing in from every direction. "If I get in that car," I said, meeting his eyes, "you do not get to control what I say or what I do with it." His gaze sharpened, not with resistance, but with consideration, like he was measuring the terms, adjusting them in his mind. "I do not control you," he said, and I almost laughed, because we both knew that was not entirely true. Not before, not now, not ever, but this was different now. I was different. "You tried to once," I replied, and something flickered in his eyes, a memory, a moment neither of us spoke about, because we did not need to. He stepped aside, then just enough to open the space between us, and gestured toward the car, not forcing, not demanding, just allowing the decision to rest where it belonged, with me. I hesitated 1 second too, then moved. The door opened before I reached it, the driver silent, unseen, and I slid into the back seat, the leather cold against my skin, the interior dim and quiet, like a sealed world separate from everything outside. He followed a second later, the door closing with a soft final sound that felt louder than it should have. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, blending into the flow of traffic like nothing unusual had happened. Like this was just another night in a city full of secrets. I stared straight ahead at first, watching the lights blur past, reflections stretching across the window like memories that refused to stay still. Where are we going? I asked finally, breaking the silence because silence with him had always been dangerous. It gave him time to think, to plan, to understand. Somewhere. We can talk, he answered simply, and I knew better than to expect more than that. Details were never given until they needed to be. I shifted slightly, turning just enough to face him, his profile sharp and the low light, eyes focused forward but aware of every movement I made. You said you wanted the truth, I continued. That does not come in pieces. You either hear all of it or none of it. He turned, then slowly, his gaze locking onto mine again, that same intensity that had followed me all night, but now there was something else beneath it, something steadier, something that felt like resolve. Then start talking, he said. My heart beat harder because this was it, the moment I had avoided for years, the moment where silence no longer protected me. I looked down at my hands, at the glove, at the faint outline of the ring beneath it, and for the first time since I stepped into that restaurant, I let the past come all the way back. The night you think I died, I began, my voice steady even as everything inside me shifted, was the night I realized your world was never going to let me belong in it without taking something from me I could not lose. He did not interrupt. He did not react outwardly, but I saw it, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his focus sharpened, like every word mattered. There was a meeting, I continued. Not one I was supposed to know about, not one I was supposed to hear, but I did, and what I heard was not about business, it was about me. His eyes darkened, just slightly, not with anger, not yet, but with something closer to understanding. Someone decided I was a risk, I said quietly, not because of what I did, but because of who I was to you. Silence filled the car again, heavier now, charged with the weight of something neither of us could ignore anymore. So you disappeared, he said finally, his voice lower, more controlled, like he was holding something back. I survived, I corrected softly, and lifted my gaze to meet his, because that was the truth that mattered, not the past, not the fear, but the fact that I was still here. And now they know you are alive, he said, and this time it was not a question. My breath caught for half a second, because that was the part one could not outrun, the part that made everything tonight more dangerous than either of us wanted to admit. If they did not before, I replied, they will soon. The car continued, moving through the city lights reflecting in his eyes, and for the first time since I saw him again, I understood something clearly. This was never just about us finding each other again, it was about everything that would come after, and the moment he chose to believe me was the moment. Nothing would stay the same again. The car slowed but did not stop. The city outside, shifting from crowded streets to quieter avenues, where the lights were softer and the buildings taller, like the world itself was stepping back to make space for what was coming. I watched the reflection of passing headlights flicker across the window, then across his face, sharp angles, shadowed eyes, unreadable, but no longer distant. There was something different now, something engaged, something that had already begun to move pieces into place without a single word being spoken. Who was in that meeting? He asked finally, his voice low, controlled, but no longer neutral. This was not curiosity, this was direction. I exhaled slowly because names had weighed in his world. Names changed things, set events into motion that could not be undone. You already know them, I said quietly, and his gaze shifted just slightly enough to tell me he was already running through possibilities, eliminating what did not fit, isolating what did. Say it anyway, he replied, because confirmation mattered more than assumption with him. It always had. I looked down at my hands again, the faint pressure of the ring beneath the glove grounding me as I forced myself to say what I had spent years keeping buried. Victor Hale was there, I said, and felt the air in the car change, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to register like a shift in gravity. His expression did not break, but something behind his eyes sharpened, instantly precise, calculating, and he prompted, because one name was never the full story, never enough to justify what I had done. And your brother signed off on it, I added quietly, and that was the moment. Something real cracked, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I saw it because I knew him, because I had once been the only person who could read what he did not say. Silence followed, not empty, but heavy, filled with implications that stretched far beyond the car, beyond the city, beyond anything either of us could pretend was simple anymore. That is not possible, he said after a moment, but there was no conviction in it, not fully, not the way there would have Been 3 years ago before everything changed, before trust became something conditional, something that had to be verified, not assumed. It was not supposed to be possible, I replied, meeting his eyes because this was the part he needed to understand, not just here. That is why I left, because I knew once it started, I would not get another chance to walk away. He leaned back slightly, not retreating, just creating space to think the way he always did. When something did not align with the version of reality he had built, "You should have come to me," he said. And there it was, not anger, not accusation, but something closer to frustration, something that still believed things could have been different. If I had chosen him instead of leaving everything behind, I did, I answered softly, and his gaze snapped back to mine instantly, the shift sharp, undeniable. "You just did not see it," I continued, because that was the truth, the part that hurt more than anything else. "I tried to warn you, but you were already in the middle of it already, trusting people I could not afford to trust anymore." His jaw tightened slightly, and I knew he was replaying the past now, searching for the moment he missed, the sign he overlooked, the detail that could have changed everything if he had only seen it in time. "So you decided for both of us," he said, and this time there was something in his voice, something closer to the edge of something he was holding back. "I decided to live," I replied, and held his gaze because I would not apologize for that. Not now, not ever, not after everything it took to get here. The car came to a smooth stop. Then outside a building I recognized without wanting to, a place tied too closely to the life I had left behind, to the world that almost kept me from having a future at all. "We are not done," he said, as the engine idled quietly, and I almost smiled, because that was the one thing I already knew. Nothing about this was finished, not the past, not the truth, not whatever was building between us now that we were no longer separated by distance and silence. "No," I agreed softly as the door opened, and the night air returned, colder than before, sharper than before, like a warning I could not ignore. "We are just getting started." And as I stepped out onto the pavement, I felt it clearly for the first time since I saw him again. This was no longer about what had happened 3 years ago. This was about what would happen next, and whether either of us was ready for the cost that came with finally facing it together. The building stood in front of me, like a memory I had tried to erase, tall glass, reflecting the city lights in cold, perfect lines, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and consequences followed without warning. I did not move at first, my heels still planted on the pavement, as if stepping forward would confirm something I was not ready to accept. "You remember it," Alexander said beside me, not as a question, but as an observation, because of course I remembered places like this did not fade. They stayed etched into you whether you wanted them to or not. "I remember enough," I replied quietly, and wrapped my coat tighter around me, even though the cold had nothing to do with the temperature. He studied the building for a moment, then looked back at me, his expression unreadable but focused. "Good," he said simply. "Then you know why we are here." I did, and that was exactly why. Every instinct in me told me to turn around, to walk away before this went any further, before the past stopped being something distant and became something active again. "If we go in there," I said slowly, "you do not get to pretend this is just business." His gaze sharpened slightly at that, like I had touched a line he had not fully acknowledged yet. "It never was," he replied, and something about the certainty in his voice made it harder to breathe, because part of me had always known that even when I tried to convince myself otherwise. We walked toward the entrance together, not close, not distant, just parallel, like two people who used to know each other better than anyone else, and now had to relearn everything step by step. The doors opened before we reached them, someone inside recognizing him instantly, the silent efficiency of his world already in motion without a single command. The lobby was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that did not belong to empty space, but to controlled space where nothing happened without permission. I felt it immediately, the shift, the weight of eyes that did not look directly but noticed. Everything cataloged, everything measured, every movement I made. "Stay close," he said under his breath, and I almost responded out of habit before catching myself, because I was not that person anymore. I did not belong to this world, not now, not again. "I can take care of myself," I replied just as quietly, but I stepped beside him anyway, because independence did not mean being careless, and whatever was waiting here was not something I could face blindly. We moved through the lobby toward a private elevator. the doors already open as if they had been expecting him, which they probably had. People like Alexander Kane were always expected, always prepared for, always accommodated without question. The ride up was silent, the kind that pressed against your ears, making every second feel longer than it should be. I watched the numbers change one floor at a time, each one bringing me closer to something I had tried to leave behind completely. When we get out, he said finally, his voice low, steady. You let me handle the conversation. I turned my head slightly, looking at him, because that was the line, the one I could not cross again. No, I said simply, and the word landed between us firm enough that he actually paused for half a second. They are here because of me, I continued, meeting his eyes, which means they will listen to me first. Something shifted in his expression, not disagreement, not exactly, but adjustment, like he was recalculating the situation with new variables he had not planned for. You think they will listen? He said, and there was no doubt in his tone, just curiosity, just assessment. I think they want to know if I am still a problem, I replied, and pressed the elevator button harder than necessary as it slowed to a stop, because that was the truth, the part neither of us could ignore. I was not just a memory walking back into this building. I was a question that had not been answered 3 years ago. The doors opened with a soft sound, and the hallway beyond was dim lit in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, revealing just enough to guide, but not enough to comfort. I stepped forward before he could move, before he could stop me, before I could change my mind, because hesitation was dangerous here, more dangerous than anything else. A door waited at the end of the hallway, slightly open, as if inviting, or maybe expecting, and I felt it again, that pull between past and present, between the life I built and the one I left unfinished. I paused just outside it, my hand hovering for a second before pushing it open fully, and stepping inside. The room was exactly how I remembered it. Long table, low lights, figures already seated, shadows and silhouettes more than faces. But I knew them. I recognized the presence, the weight, the familiarity of people who shaped decisions that reached far beyond these walls. Well, a voice said from the far end, calm, measured, unmistakably controlled. This is unexpected. I lifted my chin, meeting the direction of the voice without hesitation, because fear was not something I could show. Not here, not now, not ever again. Not as unexpected as you think, I replied, and stepped further into the room, feeling Alexander behind me, not speaking, not interrupting, just there, a presence as steady as ever. And I realized in that moment this was not just about surviving anymore. This was about rewriting something that should have ended differently 3 years ago, and making sure this time I would be the one deciding how it finished. The room did not react the way a normal room would. There were no gasps, no sudden movements, just a subtle shift in posture, a recalibration of attention, as if every person present had already prepared for something unexpected and was now adjusting to the version of it that stood in front of them. I walked further in steady, measured steps until I reached the edge of the table and stopped, not too close, not too far, exactly where I could be seen but not surrounded. Emily Carter, the voice at the head of the table, said again, this time with recognition layered beneath the calm. Victor Hale leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp, calculating every detail, like he was confirming I was real and not a memory that refused to stay buried. You were declared dead, he continued, and I almost smiled, because that was the easiest part of this entire situation. So were a lot of things that did not stay that way, I replied, my voice even controlled, because this was not the moment to show anything that could be mistaken for weakness. A faint murmur passed through the room, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to signal that the balance had shifted in a way no one had predicted. You should not have come back, another voice added from the side. One I recognized instantly, even without turning to look, because some voices never leave you no matter how far you run. I did not come back, I said slowly, shifting my gaze just enough to meet his eyes. Alexander's brother sat there exactly where I expected him, composed, controlled, but not untouched by my presence. You found me. Silence followed, again heavier this time, because that was the truth no one in this room could dismiss, not anymore, not after tonight. Victor's fingers tapped lightly against the table once, twice, then stilled as he leaned forward slightly, his attention fully locked on me now. Then let us not waste time, he said, his tone still calm, still measured, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that suggested this conversation had already begun long Before I walked into the room, you heard something you were not meant to hear 3 years ago. I held his gaze steady, refusing to look away, refusing to give him anything that resembled fear, and you decided that made me a liability. I replied, you made yourself one. He corrected smoothly, and that was the difference between us. He saw people as variables, outcomes, decisions. I saw consequences, lives, choices that could not be undone once they were set into motion. No, I said quietly, you decided what I was without asking me what I would choose. A pause followed. That statement longer than the others, not because it shocked them, but because it introduced something they did not operate with. Choice was not a factor in rooms like this. It never had been until now. Choice is a luxury, Alexander's brother said, his voice steady but colder than I remembered, and you were never in a position to afford it. I turned fully to face him then, because this part mattered more than anything else. Not the room, not the power, not the consequences, but the truth that had been left unspoken for too long. I was your family, I said simply, and for the first time since I walked in, something real crossed his expression. Not guilt, not regret, but something closer to acknowledgement, something that could not be dismissed as easily as everything else. And that is exactly why you were dangerous, he replied, and there it was, the justification, the reasoning, the logic that turned people into problems instead of people. You knew too much, and you mattered too much, which made you unpredictable. The words settled in the room, heavy, final, but I did not look away. I did not step back. Because this was the moment everything had been building toward, not the fear, not the escape, but the confrontation that should have happened years ago. Then you made the wrong decision, I said quietly, and felt it, the shift behind me, the subtle movement that told me Alexander had stepped forward, not interrupting, not speaking, just there, a presence that changed the weight of the room. Without a single word, Victor noticed it. Of course, he noticed everything, and his gaze flickered briefly past me before returning sharper, more focused. It seems that decision is no longer yours alone, he said, and the implication hung in the air, clear, unmistakable. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, because this was where everything changed, where the past stopped being something I ran from and became something I faced head on. No, I said, meeting his eyes without hesitation. It never should have been. Silence followed again. But this time it was different, not controlled, not neutral, but charged with something new, something that had not existed in this room before. Uncertainty, and for the first time since I stepped inside, I realized they were no longer looking at me as a problem to solve. They were looking at me as a variable they had not accounted for. And that was far more dangerous than anything else, because now they had to decide what to do with someone who refused to disappear again. And I had to decide how far I was willing to go to make sure they never tried. The silence stretched longer this time, not controlled, not comfortable, but uncertain, and that was something I had never seen in this room before. Uncertainty did not belong here. It was replaced quickly by calculation, by decisions, by quiet agreements made without words, but now it lingered just enough to matter. I felt Alexander step closer behind me, not touching, not interrupting, just there, and that alone shifted everything, because his presence was not neutral. It never had been. Victor noticed it again, his gaze flickering between us, not missing the distance or the lack of it. You brought her here, Victor said calmly, but there was a new edge beneath it, not anger, not yet, but awareness. Alexander's voice came from behind me, steady, controlled. She chose to come, and the distinction mattered more than anything else, because it reframed the situation entirely. I was not dragged back into this world, I stepped into it, and that made me harder to dismiss, harder to control. I held Victor's gaze. And now I am choosing to stay long enough to finish what you started. Another subtle shift in the room, a few heads tilting slightly, attention sharpening, like the pieces were rearranging themselves into a new configuration. Finish, Victor repeated, as if testing the word, measuring it. You believe something was left unfinished. I did not hesitate. You tried to remove a problem without understanding it, and now that problem is standing in front of you, asking a question you should have asked 3 years ago. He leaned back again, fingers steepled this time, his expression thoughtful, but not dismissive. And what question would that be? I felt my heartbeat steady instead of race, something settling into place inside me, because this was no longer about fear. This was about control, not his, not theirs, but mine. What did I actually know? I said clearly. And the words landed heavier than I expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, direct, impossible to ignore. You assumed I was a risk because I heard something, but you never stopped to consider whether I understood it or whether I cared about it at all. Silence followed again, but this time it was sharper, focused, like the room itself was listening more carefully than before. Information does not need to be understood to be dangerous, Alexander's brother said, his tone precise, but I caught it this time, the slight hesitation beneath the certainty, the awareness that the logic was not as solid as it once felt. No, I replied, turning toward him fully. But intent does. And you never question mine. His jaw tightened slightly, not enough to show weakness, but enough to confirm I had struck something real. Victor's gaze returned to me, slower this time, more deliberate. Then answer it now, he said. What did you know? The question hung there, simple but loaded, and for a second I considered the weight of the answer, not because I was afraid to give it, but because I understood what it would change once I did, enough to realize that whatever you were planning had nothing to do with me, I said quietly, and everything to do with power that I was never a part of and never wanted to be. A faint exhale moved through the room, not relief, not tension, just acknowledgement that the narrative they built was not aligning with the reality in front of them. You expect us to believe that? Victor asked, but this time there was no dismissal in his voice, just evaluation, just a need to confirm what no longer felt certain. I do not expect anything, I replied. I am just telling you the truth you should have asked for before making a decision you cannot undo. The words settled deeper than anything else, because that was the part they could not ignore, not the past, not the mistake, but the fact that it had consequences that reached into the present. Alexander shifted slightly behind me, and this time I felt it, the subtle alignment, the unspoken agreement that whatever this became, he was no longer separate from it. Victor noticed that too, of course he did, and for the first time his expression changed in a way that mattered, not uncertainty, not confusion, but something closer to recalculation. This is no longer just about her, he said slowly, his gaze moving briefly to Alexander before returning to me. It never was, Alexander replied, and his voice carried something different now, something that had not been there before, not just control, not just authority, but choice, the kind that changed outcomes instead of reacting to them. I felt it then, the shift fully realized, the moment where this stopped being about what happened 3 years ago and became something else entirely, something present, something active, something dangerous in a way that could not be contained by quiet rooms and controlled conversations. Then we have a decision to make, Victor said finally, and the weight of those words pressed into the room. Like a turning point, I met his gaze without hesitation, because this time I was not the one waiting for a decision, I was part of it. No, I said softly, but firmly, you have a decision to make. And for the first time since I walked in, I saw it clearly. They were no longer deciding what to do with me, they were deciding what to do with the fact that I was not afraid to stand here anymore. And that changed everything. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted again, deeper this time, quieter, but more permanent, like a line had been crossed that could not be redrawn. Victor studied me for a long moment, then leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. You are asking us to reconsider a decision that has already been made, he said calmly, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain than before. I held his gaze steady. I am not asking anything, I replied. I am telling you that the decision you made was based on the wrong assumption, and now you have to decide what that means for everything that came after it. Silence followed. Not the empty kind, but the kind filled with thought, with calculation, with the quiet weight of consequences being measured against pride, against power, against the need to remain in control. Alexander shifted slightly behind me, and this time I felt it more clearly, not just presence, but alignment, like he was no longer observing the situation, but part of it in a way that could not be separated. Victor noticed it too, his eyes flickering briefly toward him before returning to me. And what exactly are you suggesting we do, he asked, and the question mattered not because of the words, but because of what it implied. He was no longer dismissing me, he was considering options. I took a slow breath, because this was the moment where everything could change or collapse entirely. You do nothing, I said simply, and the words landed heavier than Anything else in the room, a faint reaction moved through the others, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to register confusion, surprise, even skepticism. Nothing, Victor repeated, his tone measured but sharper now. You return, after 3 years, and your solution is that we do nothing. I nodded once. You leave me out of it completely. Like I was never part of it in the first place. Because I was not. Alexander's brother let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff. But not quite. That is not how this works, he said. And there was tension in his voice now, not just logic, not just reasoning, but resistance. Everything that happens here has a reason, a structure, a consequence. I turned toward him again, meeting his eyes directly. Exactly. And I was never supposed to be part of that structure. You forced me into it. Because you were afraid of something that was never real. The words settled hard between us, and for a second he did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was recalculating everything he thought he knew. Victor leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing again, but not in the same way as before, not dismissive, not controlled, but engaged. You believe removing yourself solves the problem, he said, and I shook my head slowly. I believe I was never the problem to begin with, I replied. And if you let this continue, if you treat me like one, then you create something real out of something that never existed. Silence again, heavier now, more focused, like the room itself was leaning into the possibility I was presenting. Alexander's voice came then, low, steady, but carrying more weight than anything else that had been said. She is right. The shift was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. Every person in that room registering the change in dynamic, because his voice was not just another opinion, it was a decision point. Victor's eyes moved to him slowly, measuring not just the words but the meaning behind them. You are willing to stand behind that, Victor asked, and there was something new in his tone now, something closer to challenge than evaluation. Alexander did not hesitate. Yes, he said simply, and that one word carried more finality than anything else that had been spoken. I felt it. Then the full shift, the moment where this stopped being a conversation about the past and became a decision about the present, about what they would do now, not what they had done before. Victor leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze moving between us once more, but no longer trying to place me, no longer trying to define me, instead trying to understand what this meant for him, for everything he controlled. Then you are asking me to accept that a mistake was made, he said carefully, and I met his eyes without hesitation. I am telling you one was made, I replied, and now you decide whether you correct it or let it become something worse. The room went still, not quiet, not empty, but still, like everything had paused, waiting for the outcome of something that could not be undone. Victor's fingers tapped once more, then stopped completely as he exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, but final. Very well, he said, and the words carried a weight that settled over the entire room like a shift in gravity. For now, we will treat this as if it never happened. My breath caught, just slightly, not because I did not expect it, but because hearing it made it real, made it final. For now, I repeated quietly, because I understood what that meant. It was not forgiveness, not resolution, just a pause, a choice to stop something from escalating further. Victor's gaze held mine one last time, sharp, clear, unmistakable. Do not make me revisit this decision, he said, and I nodded once, because that was the closest thing to peace this world ever offered. I will not, I replied, and for the first time since I walked into that room, I felt it, the tension easing just slightly, not gone, not resolved, but shifted into something else, something that could be carried instead of fought against. And as I turned slightly, feeling Alexander move beside me, I realized this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of us had planned, but both of us would have to face together now that the past had finally been brought back into the light. The room did not applaud the decision, it did not acknowledge it in any visible way, but I felt it, the shift from confrontation to conclusion, the quiet agreement that nothing more needed to be said, not here, not now. I stepped back slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing just enough to let me breathe again, but not enough to forget where I was or who I was standing beside. Alexander did not speak. As we turned toward the door, he did not look back, and neither did I, because in rooms like that, looking back meant reopening something that had already been settled, at least for the moment. The hallway felt different on the way out, longer, quieter, like the weight of what had just happened was Still catching up with us, I walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, just there, aware of his presence in a way that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. "You did not tell me everything," he said finally, his voice low but steady, breaking the silence. Without urgency, I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the dim lights ahead because I knew this part was coming. I had expected it from the moment I stepped into that room. "No," I answered simply, because there was no point pretending. "Otherwise, there are things you still do not know," he continued. And this time, there was something sharper beneath the calm, not anger, not accusation, but insistence. "There are things you were not supposed to know either," I replied, and that was the truth. The line that had been crossed years ago did not disappear just because we acknowledged it. Now we reached the elevator, and the doors opened without hesitation, as if the building itself was eager to move us out of this space and back into something less controlled, less watched. The ride down was quieter than the one before, not tense, not uncertain, just heavy, with everything left unsaid. I watched the numbers change again, each one taking me further away from that room, but not from what it represented. "You trusted me once," he said suddenly, and the words landed differently than anything else he had said tonight, not as a question, not as a demand, but as something closer to memory. I closed my eyes for half a second before opening them again, because that was the part one could not ignore. Not after everything we had just faced. "I did," I answered softly. "And then you stopped," he continued, and there it was, the part he could not let go of, the part that still believed things could have been different if I had made another choice. I turned to face him fully now, because this deserved more than a quiet answer. "No," I said gently. "I never stopped trusting you. I stopped trusting the people around you, and that made staying impossible." He held my gaze, searching for something in my expression, like he was trying to separate truth from defense, but this time I did not look away. I did not soften the words or the meaning behind them. "You should have told me," he said, and there was something in his voice now, something that almost sounded like regret, but not quite fully formed. "I tried," I repeated quietly, and the memory of that night pressed in again, sharp, clear, unavoidable. "You just were not ready to hear it." The elevator slowed, and the doors opened onto the lobby. The quiet space unchanged, as if nothing had happened upstairs, as if the world outside had not shifted even slightly. I stepped out first, needing the air, needing the space between walls that listened too closely. He followed a step behind, and for a moment we stood there, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the aftermath of something neither of us had expected. When the night began, "This does not end here," he said, and I almost smiled, because that was the one thing we both understood completely. "No," I agreed softly, "it does not." We walked toward the exit together, the glass doors reflecting two versions of people who had once been something else entirely and now had to figure out what they were again. The city greeted us the same way it always did, loud, alive, indifferent to everything that had just happened behind closed doors. But for me it felt different, sharper, more real, like the distance I had created over the past 3 years was closing, whether I wanted it to or not. "You cannot go back to how it was," he said as we stepped onto the sidewalk, and I knew he was not just talking about the room or the people inside it. He was talking about us, about everything that had been left unfinished. "I was never planning to," I replied, and meant it, because going back was never an option, not after everything that had changed. "Then what are you planning?" he asked, and this time it was not a demand, not a command, just a question, one that carried more weight than anything else he had asked tonight. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the man I had loved, but the man he had become, and the space between those two versions that we now had to navigate. "I am planning to stay alive," I said simply, because that was still the most important truth of all. And for a moment something in his expression shifted, not resistance, not control, but something closer to understanding, like he was finally beginning to see the world the way I had been forced to see it 3 years ago. And as the city moved around us and the night stretched forward, I realized this was not about returning to anything that existed before. It was about deciding what came next and whether we could face it without losing ourselves again. The city noise wrapped around us like nothing had changed. Car horns, distant conversations, the steady rhythm of life moving forward without pause. But inside me, everything felt sharper, more defined, like the edges of my world had been redrawn in a single night. I took a step away from him, not leaving, just creating space, because space was the only thing that still felt like mine. You should not go back there, he said, his voice calm but carrying something deeper now, something protective but controlled, like he was still deciding how far that instinct was allowed to go. I glanced back at the building behind us, its glass reflecting the streetlights. Like nothing inside it had shifted, like the decisions made there did not ripple outward into lives that had already been changed. I was not planning to, I replied and turned back toward him, because there was no reason to pretend anymore. Not after everything we had said, not after everything he now knew. He studied me in silence for a moment longer, his gaze steady but not as hard as before. There was something else there now, something quieter, something that had not been present earlier. Then you come with me, he said, and it was not a command, not fully, but it was close enough to one that I felt the old instinct to resist rise immediately. That sounds familiar, I said softly, and his expression shifted just slightly, like he recognized the meaning behind the words without needing them explained. This is not the same, he replied, and I believed him, or at least I believed that he believed it, but that did not make it simple. Nothing is the same, I answered, and let that truth settle between us, because it mattered more than anything else we could say. He took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving mine, like he was recalibrating again, adjusting to a version of me that no longer fit into the place he once knew. Then tell me what you need, he said, and that was new, not the question itself, but the way he asked it, without assumption, without expectation, just direct and real. I hesitated, not because I did not have an answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real, would shift this from something temporary into something we would both have to carry forward. I need you to understand that this does not make me part of your world again, I said finally. I am not stepping back into that life. I am not becoming something I worked so hard to leave behind. His jaw tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of what that meant, of what it required from him. And you think I will pull you back into it, he asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation. I think your world does not let people stand near it without becoming part of it eventually. Silence followed, not tense, not uncertain, just honest, because neither of us could deny that truth, not after everything we had seen. Then we changed that, he said, and the certainty in his voice caught me off guard, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it, like it was something he had already decided, not something he was still considering. I shook my head slightly, a small movement, but enough to break whatever expectation he had built in that moment. You do not change your world for someone like me, I said quietly. You never have. He stepped closer, then not invading, not overwhelming, just enough to close the space again. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, more certain than anything he had said tonight. You are not someone like anyone else, he said, and I felt it, the weight of that statement, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true in a way that was harder to ignore than anything else. That is exactly the problem, I replied, because being different in his world was never safe. It was never simple. It was never something that lasted without cost. He held my gaze for a long moment, longer, then nodded once, like he accepted that truth, even if he did not agree with what it meant. Then we do this your way, he said finally, and something about the way he said it made it clear. This was not a temporary concession, not a tactic, but a choice. You stay where you are, you keep your life the way you built it, and I make sure nothing from my world reaches you again. I searched his expression for a sign that this was another version of control, another way of keeping me close without saying it, but I did not find it. I found something else, something quieter, something that felt closer to respect than anything else he had offered before. You cannot control everything, I said softly, because that was the one truth he needed to understand. If this was going to work at all, no, he agreed. And for the first time, there was no resistance in his voice, no need to argue against it. But I can control enough. The words settled between us, not as a promise, not as a guarantee, but as something in between, something that acknowledged the reality we were both facing without pretending it could be solved easily. I looked at him, then really looked at him, and saw the shift clearly, not just in his words, but in the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he was choosing something different, even if he did not fully understand what that would require yet. Then we try, I said quietly, because that was the only thing left, the only path forward that did not involve running again or falling back into something neither of us could survive the same way twice. And as the night stretched out around us, and the city moved forward without noticing anything that had changed, I realized this was not about the past anymore. It was about whether two people from completely different worlds could stand in the same space without one of them losing everything again. The night did not feel the same anymore, not after everything that had been said, not after everything that had shifted between us and the world we stood in. I looked up at the skyline, the lights stretching endlessly across the horizon, each one belonging to someone who did not know how close everything had come to breaking apart. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the world kept moving because people like us carried the weight quietly, so nothing else had to. Alexander stood beside me, not speaking, not pushing, just there, and for the first time since I saw him again, it did not feel like pressure. It felt like presence, something steady, something real. 3 years, he said finally, his voice softer than I had ever heard it before, and I knew he was not asking for details, not asking for explanations, just acknowledging the time that had passed, the distance that had existed between us. It felt longer, I replied honestly, because it had, every day stretched by choices I had to make alone, every moment shaped by the need to survive without looking back. He nodded once, like he understood, even if he could never fully know what those years had been like for me. And now he continued, but did not finish the sentence because he did not need to. We both knew what now meant. It meant standing here not as who we used to be, but as who we had become, and deciding if there was any way forward that did not repeat the past. I exhaled slowly, letting the air settle in my chest, because this was the part no one prepared you for, not the escape, not the survival, but the moment when you no longer had to run and had to decide what to do. With that freedom, now we learn how to exist in the same world without destroying each other, I said quietly, and the truth of it hung between us heavier than anything else that had come before. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not control, not expectation, but something closer to acceptance, like he was finally seeing me as I was, not as who I had been to him before. That sounds more difficult than anything we have faced, he said, and there was a hint of something almost like humor beneath the words, but it was grounded in truth, not lightness. It is, I agreed, because there was no point pretending otherwise, but it is the only way this works. Silence followed again, but this time it was different, not heavy, not uncertain, just quiet, like the kind that came after something important had been decided, even if the details were still unclear. A car passed the headlights briefly, illuminating us again, and I caught my reflection in the glass of a nearby window. For a split second, a woman who had once disappeared, standing beside the man who had once defined her life. And I realized something I had not expected to feel. I did not look like someone who was running anymore. I looked like someone who had chosen to stay. Alexander followed my gaze for a moment, then back to me. You kept the ring, he said, and his voice held something softer now, something that did not demand an answer, but hoped for one. I hesitated just slightly before pulling off the glove, the cool air brushing against my skin as I revealed the thin band, still resting where it had always been. I did not explain it, I did not justify it, because I did not need to. The truth was simple. Some things were never about logic or choice, they were about meaning, and this had always meant something more than either of us had been able to define. He looked at it for a moment, then back at me, and there was no triumph in his expression, no assumption, just understanding, the kind that did not need words. I never stopped being her, I said quietly, not looking away, because this was not something to hide. I just stopped being part of everything around it. He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him, like it fit into whatever new understanding he was building piece by piece. Then we do not go back, he said, finally, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just decision. We move forward. I felt something shift inside me at those words, not relief, not certainty, but something close to possibility, something I had not allowed myself to consider in a long time. Forward, I repeated softly, because it sounded unfamiliar, but not impossible. He took a step back, then giving me space, not leaving, just allowing me to stand on my own terms, without expectation, without pressure. And that small gesture meant more than anything else he could have said. I will not follow you tonight, he added, and there was something deliberate in that choice, something intentional. But I will not lose you again either. I met his gaze one last time, the weight of everything we had been, everything we had lost, and everything we might still become settling quietly between us. You will not, I said. Because for the first time I believed it not. As a promise, not as a certainty, but as a possibility worth holding on to. I turned, then stepping into the flow of the city, not running, not hiding, just moving forward. And for the first time in 3 years, I did not feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was walking towards something unknown, something uncertain, something real. And behind me, I knew he was still there, not chasing, not pulling, just watching, waiting, learning how to stand in the same world as me without taking it over. And maybe that was what this had always been about, not power, not fear, not even survival, but two people learning that sometimes the hardest thing to do is not holding on or letting go. It is choosing to change and hoping that this time it is enough.